Okay, so in this section we're going to continue factoring of this form 1x squared plus bx plus c. But this section we're going to actually do it using the grouping method. So let me give you the steps that you need to do to do the grouping method. Okay, so here's what you want to do. You want to find two numbers, and we'll call them m and n. And those two numbers, we want their product to be the same as a times c. Now when I say a times c, I'm talking up here, the a is 1, and then c would be whatever this number is. So we'll do that. But the other thing that's got to be true about these two numbers m and n, their sum has to be equal to b. So their sum has to be this coefficient. Okay? Now this will make more sense once you see an example. But what we want to do here is once we find m and n, we can actually replace this b term, this bx, with the two numbers. We can break that term up into those two numbers. Like, you know, if that was 5x, we might replace this with 3x plus 2x or something like that. So we'll be able to replace it with that. And so here's an example. Suppose the b term is 10x and m is 8 and n is 2. Then you would replace the 10x with 8x plus 2x. And that will give you 4 terms instead of 3 terms. And then once we have 4 terms, we can actually factor this by the 4 terms by the grouping method, as we learned earlier. It might sound complex at first, but it's really not that big of a deal. It's not that hard, especially on these. And some of this will sound familiar from the trial and error method on these particular problems. So let me just show you how to do this. So let's say we have 1x squared minus 15x plus 56. Now since a is 1, coefficient of x squared is 1, and c is 56, then a times c would be 1 times 56. So a times c would simply be 56. And the b would be the coefficient of the x term, so that would just be the negative 15. So basically we're looking for two numbers whose product is 56 and whose sum is negative 15. Well, that's going to give us the negative 8 and the negative 7 again. Again, this sounds familiar because the coefficient of this term is just 1. But let me show you what we're going to do. Once we determine that the two numbers are negative 8 and negative 7, we can actually replace negative 15x here with a negative 8x minus 7x. So notice right here, I'm going to rewrite the trinomial, but I'm going to replace the negative 15x with the negative 8x minus 7x. Well, now I can actually group this. I can group these two terms together, and then I can group these two terms together, and then factor out the common factor. So in the first two terms, the common factor is 8. So that factors into x times x minus 8. And in the second two terms, I can factor out a negative 7, and that'll give me minus 7 times x minus 8. And now notice in the first term, you have a factor of x minus 8. In the second term, you have a factor of x minus 8. And then if we factor that x minus 8 out, like we did for grouping, we get x minus 8 factored out. And then what we're left with in the other factor is the x minus 7. So that gives us the factors as x minus 8, x minus 7. Again, this method is not, that great on these simple problems that I'm doing, but it actually works much better when you get to problems that have coefficients of the squared term other than 1. Let's just do a couple more. Here we have x squared plus 21x minus 100. So a times c would be negative 100, and of course b would be 21. So again, we need to replace this 21 with two numbers whose product is negative 100 and whose sum is 21. Well, that's going to be the -4 and the 25 that we, kind of like what we had earlier. So you can replace 21x with -4x plus 25x. And then if you factor an x out of the first two terms, you get x times x minus 4. And if you factor a 25 out of the last two terms, you get 25 times x minus 4. And then you can factor the x minus 4 out of these two terms, and you get x minus 4 as one factor, and then what's left is the x plus 25 as the other factor. And here's another one, just a squared plus 25a plus 156. You can actually just replace the 25a with 13a plus 12a, because since 13 times 12 is 156 and 13 plus 12 is 25, we can replace the 25a here with the 13a plus 12a, and then we can factor the a out of the first two terms to get a plus 13, and then factor a 12 out of the last two terms and get 12 times a plus 13, and then we can factor the a plus 13 out and get a plus 13 times a plus 12. And then the last one, we can actually replace -10xy with -16xy plus 6xy, since -16 times 6 is -96, which is the product of 1 and -96. So now if we replace -10xy with -16xy plus 6xy, then we can factor an x out of the first two terms and get x times x minus 16y, and then factor a 6y out of the second two terms, and we get 6y times x minus 16y, and again you can see the common factor here of x minus 16y, and if you factor that out you get x minus 16y times x plus 6y for the factors. Now I'll go ahead and just mention here completely factoring. Anytime you factor something, you should always factor completely. So let me just show you some examples here of where you want to factor completely. So take a look at this example here, and you can see that I have a common factor of a in these three terms. So I can first thing I want to do is factor out the greatest common factor a. So if I factor a out, I get a times b squared plus 7b minus a. Well, then always check your factors and see if they'll factor again. B squared plus 7b minus 8, we can factor that into b plus 8 and b minus 1 using either trial and error or grouping method. And so this one actually has three factors: a, b plus 8, and b minus 1. The next one we can factor out, the common factor here that we can factor out is 4y. So if I factor a 4y out of each of these, I'll get 4y outside. And then the next factor would be, if you factor a 4y out of here, you get y squared. Factor 4y out of here, you get 3y. And factor a 4y out of -72y, and you get minus 18. Well, the y squared plus 3y minus 18 actually will factor into y plus 6, y minus 3. So actually I have three factors: 4y times y plus 6 times y minus 3. And then this third one here, you can factor a common factor of 3 out. So factor 3 out of these terms, and you'll have 3 on the outside, and then on the inside you'll have x squared plus x minus 12. And the x squared plus x minus 12 factors into x plus 4, x minus 3. So this factors into 3 times x plus 4 times x minus 3. And then on this last one, I'm going to do the little trick I showed you earlier of factoring out a -1. So I'm going to factor out a -1 out of each of these terms. And when I do that, remember it changes all the signs. So this is going to be a plus x squared. I'm going to write it first. And then the minus 4x is going to be a plus 4x. I'm going to write it next. And then the positive 12 changes to a negative 12, so I'm going to write it next. So I have a minus 1 times x squared plus 4x minus 12, and then I'm going to factor x squared plus 4x minus 12 as x plus 6 and x minus 2, and I have a negative 1 as the other factor. So the factors are negative 1 times x plus 6 times x minus 2. And actually, you can just put a negative there. You can remove the 1 and just leave the negative sign there if you prefer. So in the next video, I'm actually going to talk to you about factoring trinomials of the form ax squared plus bx plus c, where a is not 1. And those are more difficult to factor.